Dear listeners, gather close. Today, I bring you a story of ambition, secrets, and a wedding that defied all expectations. You see, a billionaire named Ethan Ward, an empire in his grasp and an iron will in his heart, believed he was marrying a woman who would be as plain as day. He expected a quiet, businesslike arrangement, nothing more. But when the veil was lifted, everything changed. Before him stood not the ugly woman he thought he was settling for, but a woman so stunning that even his unshakable confidence faltered. A woman who would not just be his wife, but would turn his world upside down. What, you ask, made Ethan freeze before that altar? Was it Giselle's breathtaking beauty? Or was there something far deeper behind the veil? A woman whose quiet strength was hidden beneath a carefully crafted mask. Oh, dear listeners, there is more to this tale than the reveal of a beautiful bride. The question is, can a man so caught in his own empire of control learn to love? Or is he too far gone in his own arrogance to see the truth? If you're ready to hear the whole story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's get into it. To truly understand this shocking moment at the altar, we must first understand Ethan Ward, a man whose fortunes were built not on love, but on ruthless precision and the steely determination to conquer. He had no place for affection, especially not when it came to a marriage that was nothing more than a business transaction. But fate, as it often does, has a way of changing the rules. Let me take you back to how Ethan came to find himself standing at the altar, ready to marry a woman he thought he knew, only to discover that nothing about her, or about him, was what he had expected. Ethan Ward, at the age of 34, had mastered many things: business, real estate, negotiations, and appearances. The world knew him as one of the city's most powerful billionaires. A man who always had a plan, who prided himself on his control over every aspect of his life. Love was not something he had ever felt he needed. His success, his empire, his family's legacy were all that truly mattered. When his father passed, leaving behind a crumbling legacy, Ethan had made it his sole mission to rebuild the Ward name. The death of his father had ignited an unrelenting fire within him, but it also left him with a series of debts and expectations he was determined to crush. Ethan would marry for business, for the future of the family name, nothing more, nothing less. So when the opportunity to marry Giselle Lockwood presented itself, he didn't hesitate. The Lockwoods, known for their immense wealth and influential connections, were the perfect match. Giselle, on the other hand, had lived a quiet life in the shadow of her family's wealth. While society spoke of her beauty, there was little else to distinguish her. He knew the rumors, the whispers of her plainness, her lack of social grace, her absence from the vibrant balls and soirees the ton attended. The thought of marrying her had been a cold, necessary decision, made for the sake of securing his position in society. The engagement had been quick, practical, and rooted entirely in financial and social gain. There was no romance in the equation, just a cold, calculated decision. The arrangement suited Ethan just fine. After all, the price of success was sacrifice. He had no room in his life for distractions like love. As the day of the wedding drew nearer, Ethan found himself in the midst of a world that seemed more like a performance than real life. He moved through the motions, his eyes on the end game, securing his father's estate and wealth. It had all been decided long before Giselle walked into his life. She was a business partner, a vessel to carry on the Ward legacy. Nothing more. Still, there was something about her, an unexpected quality that gnawed at him. The few interactions they'd had were civil enough. She spoke with poise, though with a hint of coldness that mirrored his own. She seemed resigned to the union, as if she, too, had made peace with the business arrangement. But her composure, while admirable, was also alienating. There was no spark between them, no chemistry to speak of. She was simply there. So when the wedding day finally arrived, Ethan expected the same, an empty ritual. His thoughts focused on the future, on the next building project, on the empire that awaited him. But as the ceremony began, something inside Ethan shifted. The church was grand, the guests murmuring in their seats, all eyes on him. The air was thick with anticipation, with judgment. Whispers of what this union meant for both families, for the future, for the city. It felt like a performance, a spectacle. And then, the doors opened. Giselle appeared in the doorway, shrouded by a thick veil, her figure hidden beneath layers of lace and satin. Ethan's eyes tracked her, his thoughts distant, uninterested. This wasn't about her. It was about business. But then she moved closer, gliding toward him, her steps steady, her posture regal. A hush fell over the church, and for the first time, Ethan noticed something he hadn't expected. There was grace in the way she walked, in the way she held herself. She wasn't the delicate, meek figure he had assumed. She was solid, grounded, and undeniably composed. As she neared the altar, Ethan felt a strange pressure in his chest. Was it guilt? Was it nerves? He couldn't say for sure. His mind tried to push the feeling away, but it lingered. The vicar's voice broke through his haze, and he heard the familiar words, "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" But Ethan couldn't tear his gaze away from her. She stood beside him, but her presence felt so far away. The veil was lifted. In that single moment, everything Ethan had believed about this marriage shattered. Giselle's face was revealed, and she was stunning. Her features, delicate yet strong, her eyes, the same shade of green he'd seen 100 times in his business meetings, now stared at him with a mix of quiet determination and a hint of something else. She wasn't just the plain woman he'd prepared for. She was beautiful, in a way that took him by surprise. She wasn't just a vessel for the Ward name. She was someone who could command attention. And yet, there was something else. Something in the way she looked at him. Something unyielding, almost defiant. For a moment, Ethan felt as though the world around him had stopped. The room grew warmer, and he realized his heart was racing. He had no idea what was happening to him. But in that instant, he knew one thing for sure. This was not the woman he had expected. She had an air of control about her that unsettled him. This was a woman who would not be ignored, who would not sit idly by while he played the role of controlling partner. She didn't need him. She wasn't a woman who was desperate for his approval. The reality of their marriage, of this entire arrangement, began to dawn on him in that single moment. The ceremony proceeded, but Ethan wasn't present. His mind raced, and his heart thudded in his chest. Giselle, as he would later find out, had known the deal. She had agreed to this marriage, to the arrangement her father had set up, because it was the only option left for her. Her father's wealth had been her safety net, but it wasn't enough. She had played the part, staying quiet and obedient in a world that hadn't offered her anything but whispers and cold stares. She had known she was never meant to be the beautiful woman on the arm of a powerful man. She had resigned herself to being the woman behind the scenes, working to maintain what was left of her family's name. But what no one expected was that, Beneath that composed exterior, beneath the quiet elegance, was a mind capable of far more than anyone had ever imagined. Later that evening, at the reception, the weight of the day began to settle in. The guests circled them like vultures, their eyes filled with curiosity. This marriage, this union of convenience, had become the talk of the town. There were whispers, speculative glances, and the clinking of champagne glasses. Ethan had never been a man to take kindly to the opinions of others. But now, with Giselle beside him, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was under a microscope. Every gesture, every glance, was being scrutinized. Giselle, however, remained unaffected. As she moved through the crowd, speaking to people with ease, engaging in conversations, Ethan could see how effortlessly she fit in. It was as if she had always belonged in this world, even if it had never seemed to care about her. As the evening wore on, the events of the day began to feel more surreal. The reality of the marriage was setting in for Ethan. He had agreed to this. He had committed to this. But it wasn't just about the business now. He could feel the undercurrent of tension between them, a tension he hadn't prepared for. Giselle wasn't the woman he had expected. She wasn't the meek, quiet figure he had imagined. She was someone who challenged him without saying a word. And as they danced their first dance together, Ethan couldn't help but wonder if, perhaps, this marriage would be more complicated than he had ever anticipated. The night ended with no grand gestures, no passionate moments. It was simply a quiet, hollow affair. Ethan had married for duty, but for the first time, he was unsure if that was enough. Ethan Ward had always believed that business was straightforward. Numbers, negotiations, contracts, and profits were simple. There were no mysteries, no unexpected variables. And yet, as the days passed in the aftermath of his wedding to Giselle, he quickly realized that this particular deal, this marriage, was anything but predictable. The first few days after the wedding passed in a blur of public appearances and well-wishing relatives. They had made their rounds through society, attending galas and charity events, always arm in arm, but never truly engaging. He had expected the silence between them to be comfortable, even desirable. Yet, with each passing day, that silence began to feel more like a challenge. Giselle, on the surface, was everything he had expected. She was quiet, composed, dignified. She did her duty as his wife with precision, and as they sat through dinners and conversations, she was the perfect partner, never causing a stir, never demanding more than what was required. But there was something lurking beneath the surface, something that Ethan couldn't quite place. It wasn't just that she was beautiful. That much he had already discovered, to his surprise. It was the way she seemed to be completely unaware of her beauty, as though it didn't matter to her at all. When she walked into a room, all eyes turned to her, but Giselle never seemed to notice. Her demeanor was serene, almost detached, as though she existed in her own world. Ethan found that infuriating and strangely compelling. In their private moments, when they were alone at Ashford Manor, the tension between them grew. Ethan, the man who had controlled every aspect of his life, felt utterly disoriented. Giselle moved through their home like a ghost, quiet, graceful, yet with an undeniable presence. She would linger in the drawing room, reading her books or playing the piano. But there was an air of independence about her that Ethan could not ignore. She didn't need him, didn't crave his attention, and that struck him with a force he wasn't prepared for. One afternoon, a week into their marriage, they found themselves in the library. Ethan had retreated to his sanctuary, hoping for a moment of peace. But Giselle was already there, sitting in the leather chair he usually claimed as his own, reading a book by one of his favorite authors. Shakespeare. For a moment, Ethan stood in the doorway, watching her. Her hair was pulled back loosely, a few stray strands falling around her face. She seemed completely absorbed in the book, her brow furrowed in concentration. He hadn't expected her to be a reader, let alone someone who would choose Shakespeare. "Did you read this in school?" he asked, his voice sharp as if to break the silence. Giselle glanced up, her emerald eyes meeting his with a coolness that sent a strange shiver down his spine. "No," she replied simply. "I've read it before, but I find it even more interesting now." Ethan's eyebrow quirked, intrigued despite himself. "What makes you say that?" She closed the book with a soft thud and placed it on the table beside her. "I find his observations on power and betrayal rather fitting," she said, her tone nonchalant. "It's fascinating how the same themes have been relevant for centuries. Don't you think?" Ethan blinked, taken aback. The way she spoke, so calmly, as if discussing an everyday topic, made him uncomfortable. She wasn't asking for his approval or guidance. She wasn't seeking validation, like most women of her class. No, Giselle was challenging him without even trying, and that, more than anything, unsettled him. "I've never thought about it that way," Ethan admitted, moving further into the room. "But perhaps you're right." Giselle's lips curved into a smile, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "It's the advantage of reading," she said. "You can take something old and make it new, shape it to your own perspective." That was the moment it hit him. The realization that Giselle was not the woman he had imagined. She wasn't a passive participant in their marriage. She was more than just a pawn in the game of securing his family's legacy. She was a person, complex, intelligent, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan wasn't sure how to handle her. The next few days followed a similar pattern. They spent more time together than either had expected, forced into proximity by the nature of their shared life. At dinners, Giselle's conversations were always polite, measured, and insightful. She seemed to enjoy their debates, whether about literature, economics, or politics, often challenging Ethan's ideas in ways that made him pause and think. But with every conversation, with every debate, Ethan found himself at odds with her. His mind screamed that this marriage was supposed to be simple, practical, transactional. And yet, the more time he spent with her, the more he realized that she was more than he had bargained for. The attraction he had felt at the altar began to grow, but it was mixed with a sense of irritation that he couldn't ignore. Why couldn't she just be the dutiful, silent wife he had expected? One evening, after yet another heated discussion about the future of his business ventures, they found themselves walking through the gardens of Ashford Manor. The cool air of early autumn whipped around them, and for the first time since their wedding, the silence between them wasn't filled with tension. It was simply peaceful. Ethan noticed how Giselle moved effortlessly through the garden, her posture straight, but with an easy grace. There was no pretense in her. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, least of all him. She simply existed, and that was somehow more than enough. "You're quiet," Giselle remarked, glancing at him as they reached the edge of the lake that bordered the estate. Ethan forced a smile. "I'm just thinking." "About?" she prompted, her tone curious but not pushy. He hesitated. He had no intention of opening up to her, not yet. But there was something about the way she looked at him that made him feel like she understood without needing to be told. "About what this marriage means," he said finally, his voice gruff. "What it's supposed to be. I thought I had it all figured out." "And now?" Giselle asked softly, her eyes trained on the water. "Now, I'm not so sure," he admitted. everything feels different. Not bad, just different. For the first time since their wedding, Ethan saw a flicker of something behind her eyes. Not pity or judgment, just understanding. "You're not the only one," she said quietly. "I never expected this either." The simplicity of her words left Ethan speechless. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but it hadn't been this honesty, this admission of shared uncertainty. For a moment, their paths seemed to align in a way neither had planned. And yet, it was the most human thing either of them had experienced since the wedding. As they stood there, the tension between them shifted. It wasn't gone, not entirely, but it had changed. They weren't enemies. They weren't strangers. They were two people, both trying to figure out what came next. Ethan didn't know where this would go. He had spent so many years building an empire, controlling everything in his life, that he had forgotten how to deal with something unpredictable. Something like this. As the night deepened and they walked back inside, the reality of their new life loomed large. Ethan knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that their marriage was far more complicated than either had imagined. But for the first time, he realized that maybe, just maybe, this was exactly what he needed. Giselle wasn't what he expected. She wasn't the woman he had envisioned in his plans. She was more. And though it terrified him, he couldn't shake the feeling that, for better or worse, they were bound together now. This was a partnership, an unpredictable, messy, real partnership. The days following their quiet moment by the lake passed like a slow, tentative waltz. Each step between Ethan and Giselle seemed measured, unsure, as though they were both trying to figure out how to navigate the delicate balance of their new life together. Despite the shifts in their relationship, nothing outwardly changed. They still attended the requisite social functions, still smiled for the cameras, and still maintained their roles as the perfect, aristocratic couple. But behind closed doors, the distance between them seemed to close a fraction more each day. Ethan found himself at the crossroads of duty and desire. His mind told him to remain focused, to continue with the carefully constructed life he had built for himself. But Giselle was an enigma he couldn't ignore, an equation that refused to be solved, a presence that grew more and more impossible to dismiss. She wasn't just his wife anymore. She was someone who demanded his attention, his thoughts, his respect, and maybe, just maybe, his heart. It was one of those mornings when he found himself in the library, once again buried in paperwork, when the sound of soft footsteps behind him made him look up. Giselle had entered the room, her hair neatly pulled back into a low chignon, a book in hand. She looked almost serene, but Ethan had come to learn that serenity was often a mask. Beneath it, he could sense the flicker of thoughts, emotions, and desires that mirrored his own growing confusion. "Good morning," she said, her voice still carrying that calm, distant quality. There was no urgency in her tone, no expectation. It was simply a greeting, a moment of acknowledgement between two people bound by more than just a paper contract. Ethan forced a smile, setting aside the papers he had been reviewing. "Morning?" She walked across the room, her steps silent, as she always did. She seemed to glide, not just across the room, but through life, untouched by the complications that plagued him. Ethan couldn't help but notice how different she was from the women he had known, how different she was from the women he thought he wanted. Giselle placed the book down on the table in front of him, the cover visible now. It was a volume of poetry by an obscure poet Ethan had never heard of. She must have sensed his curiosity because she spoke without prompting. "I thought you might enjoy this," she said, her tone almost apologetic, though it didn't need to be. It's from a poet who's been largely forgotten, but his work is quite raw in a way that's unlike the usual flowery stuff. Ethan eyed the book for a moment before glancing back at her, surprised by the gift. You read it? Occasionally, Giselle replied, her fingers brushing the edges of the pages. It's not as well known as some of the more popular poets, but his words resonate with me. They're honest. Her eyes met his for a brief moment, a flicker of vulnerability crossing her features. It was the first time she had shared something so personal, and it caught Ethan off guard. He had spent so much time focusing on the logistics of their marriage that he hadn't stopped to wonder what Giselle truly wanted, what she truly needed. And here she was, offering him a glimpse of herself through a book of words that held meaning for her. He reached out, flipping open the cover of the book, his fingers lingering on the rough texture of the paper. I'll read it, he said, not entirely sure why he felt compelled to make that promise. But somehow, it felt like the right thing to do. Giselle gave a slight nod, stepping away from the table. I'll leave you to it then. She turned, her movements graceful, as always. But Ethan noticed the faintest trace of hesitation in her steps, as if she were waiting for something. For a moment, their gazes met, and in that fleeting instant, something unspoken passed between them. Something neither of them had yet figured out how to articulate. As she walked away, leaving him alone with the book, Ethan's mind swirled with questions. What had he been expecting from this marriage? Certainly not the complexities that came with being partnered with someone like Giselle. Someone who was both beautiful and enigmatic, who could challenge him intellectually, yet remain emotionally distant. Days turned into weeks, and the tension between them remained. Though it was different now. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It was just present. Giselle continued to amaze him with her intellect and her calm resolve. But Ethan found himself wanting more. The problem was, he had no idea how to ask for it. Every time he tried to bridge the gap, every time he reached for something beyond the surface, she would retreat, like a bird caught in a net, just out of his reach. It was on a crisp autumn evening, as they prepared for yet another public event, that the first real shift happened. They had been dressed in their finest for the gala, a grand event that the upper echelons of society would undoubtedly attend. Giselle stood in front of the mirror, her gown a cascade of deep emerald silk that clung to her figure like a second skin. Her hair was done up in intricate curls, the pale glow of her skin contrasting against the rich fabric. She was breathtaking. Ethan watched her from the doorway, his heart beating a little faster than usual. Something about this moment, the beauty, the elegance, the quiet tension, felt like a turning point. He had grown accustomed to her aloofness, to the emotional distance she had kept. But tonight, something in him stirred. Maybe it was the reflection of the woman in front of him, more than just the wife he had married. But a person, a partner who had as much to offer as he did. Giselle turned to look at him, her eyes catching his in the mirror. Do you think we'll survive tonight? She asked, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Ethan chuckled, though it was tinged with uncertainty. If we can survive our first month, I think we can handle any gala. Her smile widened, and for a moment she seemed to soften. But then, as if a veil had been drawn over her expression, the smile faded, and she turned back to adjust a small curl at the back of her neck. Ethan felt a pang of disappointment, but quickly shoved it aside. Right, she replied quietly. I suppose I should expect that of us by now. Surviving, I mean. They left the manor in separate carriages. Their appearance at the gala, nothing more than a display for the society of London. But the whispers that followed them this time weren't full of pity. They were full of curiosity. Giselle, the beautiful but quiet wife. Ethan, the stoic, unbothered husband. They made the perfect pair in public. But behind the walls of Ashford Manor, the cracks were beginning to show. As the night wore on and they moved through the crowds, exchanging pleasantries and exchanging polite smiles, Ethan couldn't shake the sense that they were being watched. By whom, he wasn't sure, but he was starting to feel it. The unspoken tension that had been between them for weeks had become something else now. Something more tangible, more real. Something that both terrified and excited him. As the night came to a close and the guests began to trickle out, Ethan found himself back at Giselle's side. She was still composed, still perfect in every way, but there was something about the way she held herself now, a subtle shift in the way she regarded him. They exchanged no words as they left the ballroom, their path leading them back to the carriages, the same silence hanging between them. But in that silence, something had changed. And for the first time since their wedding, Ethan wasn't sure what came next. But he knew one thing for certain. Nothing about his marriage to Giselle would be as easy as he had first thought. The days after the gala passed in a blur of public appearances and private reflections. Ethan was beginning to feel the weight of his own indecision. He had spent so long living a life of rigid expectations, always in control, always determined to uphold the image of the perfect heir to the Ashford fortune. But this marriage with Giselle was different. She was not a piece to be placed neatly in his life, nor was she content to play the role of the obedient, silent wife. She was a challenge, a puzzle that refused to be solved by logic alone. Ethan often found himself staring at her across rooms, watching the way she moved, the way she interacted with the world around her. She was brilliant and poised, sure, but there was also a fire in her eyes that he couldn't quite ignore. It made him uncomfortable in a way that was both thrilling and unnerving. One late afternoon, as the shadows of the trees outside Ashford Manor stretched long into the horizon, Ethan found himself standing by the window in his study. The house was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of servants moving through the halls. The stillness was suffocating, and yet, despite the silence, Ethan could feel the tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. He knew he needed to confront this, to understand the ever-widening gulf that seemed to separate him from Giselle. But every time he thought about addressing the distance between them, he was reminded of the vows he had made, of the cold reality that this marriage was never meant to be about love, but about securing his future. Duty, responsibility. These were the things that should have mattered to him. And yet, all he could think about now was Giselle. Her smile, her sharp wit, the way she challenged him in a way no one ever had before. The crackling of a distant fire brought him back to the present. He turned to see Giselle standing in the doorway, her arms crossed loosely over her chest, as though she had been watching him for a while. "Are you always this pensive?" she asked, her voice quiet but carrying that familiar edge of curiosity. Ethan studied her for a moment, noting the faint shadows under her eyes, the tension that lingered in her posture. She was a woman constantly on guard, never fully relaxed, even in her own home. "I was thinking," he admitted, lowering his gaze to the papers scattered on his desk, "about what happens next. About us." There was a long pause. Giselle didn't move, but he could sense her hesitation, as though she wasn't sure how much of herself she could offer without exposing too much. But then, as though she had made up her mind, she crossed the room and took a seat in the chair across from him, her eyes fixed firmly on his. "What do you mean, Ethan?" she asked, her tone even, though there was a slight tremor in her voice that betrayed her calm demeanor. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his hands folded in front of him. He wasn't sure what to say next. The truth felt too raw, too vulnerable to voice aloud, yet the words kept pushing at the edges of his thoughts. "I mean, this marriage," he began, struggling to find the right words. "This arrangement we've made. I've been wondering if we'll ever move past the place we started. If it's possible for us to actually—" He broke off, suddenly unsure of himself. How could he finish that thought? How could he say that he wanted more than just this contract, more than just the cold arrangement they had agreed to? Giselle's eyes softened, though she didn't interrupt him. She was listening, her expression a mix of empathy and quiet understanding. Her gaze seemed to pierce straight through him, as though she could see the depths of his confusion, the struggle between the man he was and the man he wanted to be. "You want more?" she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, as though she was echoing the words he had been too afraid to say. "But we don't even know how to begin, do we?" Ethan felt his heart tighten at her words. There was an undeniable truth in them, one that he had been too frightened to acknowledge. They were both in uncharted territory, two strangers bound by a marriage that neither had chosen for love. And yet, something had shifted, something neither of them could ignore. "We don't," he replied, his voice low. I thought I could keep things simple, but I'm not sure anymore." There was a long moment of silence between them, and for the first time in weeks, it wasn't uncomfortable. In fact, it felt almost comforting, as though they had found some mutual understanding, even if it was unspoken. Giselle stood and walked over to the window, looking out over the vast expanse of Ashford Manor. The trees were beginning to change color, their leaves tinged with gold and amber. The beauty of the landscape seemed to mirror the complexity of their situation. "I thought I knew what I was getting into," she said quietly, her back to him. "A marriage of convenience, just like you. No expectations beyond what was required of us. But now—" She trailed off, and Ethan could hear the emotion in her voice, the cracks in her carefully composed exterior. His heart surged with something that was both guilt and longing. He stood up and walked over to her, stopping a few feet away, unsure of how to bridge the gap that remained between them. "I don't want to hurt you, Giselle," he said, his voice thick with sincerity. "I never wanted this to be hard." She turned to face him, her eyes soft, almost wistful. "I don't want it to be hard either, Ethan. But we can't pretend anymore, can we? This distance, this wall we've built between us, it's not going to disappear on its own." For the first time, she reached out and placed her hand on his arm, her touch light but deliberate. Ethan's pulse quickened at the contact, and he was reminded, once again, how little he truly knew her, how little they had shared beyond the surface. "I want to understand you, Giselle," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "I want to try. I know I've kept you at arm's length, but he faltered, unsure of how to continue. But she smiled at him, a sad, knowing smile, and squeezed his arm gently. "I know, Ethan. I know," she said, her voice warm despite the distance that remained. "But the question is, do you really want to understand me? Or do you just want to fix things? To go back to what we had before? Because it's not the same anymore, and I'm not sure it ever will be." Ethan stood there, frozen, unsure of how to respond. For the first time in this marriage, he wasn't just navigating a business arrangement. He wasn't just checking off the duties required of him. For the first time, he was standing on the edge of something deeper, something that demanded more from him than he had ever been prepared to give. The rest of the evening passed in a haze, both of them returning to their separate rooms, each lost in their own thoughts. But as Ethan lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he realized that Giselle had been right. There was no going back. The walls they had built, both around their hearts and their marriage, had already begun to crumble. The question now was, could they rebuild something stronger from the rubble? The mornings had always been a time of order for Ethan. A quiet, predictable ritual of coffee and letters, a gentle pacing of the day before the inevitable march toward evening. But recently, the mornings had become increasingly disorienting. It wasn't just that his thoughts wandered toward Giselle more often than he cared to admit. It was that she had begun to shift the very ground he had once considered solid. This morning, however, the air was different. There was a heaviness in the house, a tension that felt like a storm waiting to break. He could feel it in the way the staff moved. Quick, furtive glances exchanged in hallways, the cautious way they greeted him. Even the birds outside seemed quieter, as though they too knew something had changed. It was a sense of foreboding that had crept in overnight, and Ethan had no idea how to confront it. He had spent hours the night before contemplating his actions, wondering whether Giselle would ever look at him the same way again after their conversation in the study. Would she understand? Could they move forward? Or had he broken something beyond repair? It wasn't until mid-morning, when he was deep into reviewing the estate's ledgers, that the knock came at his door. His heart skipped at the interruption. He hadn't expected a visitor, least of all Giselle. "Enter," he called, his voice a little rougher than usual. The door creaked open, and there she stood, framed in the doorway, her silhouette sharp against the bright morning light streaming through the windows. For a moment, Ethan froze, caught off guard by the sight of her. Her auburn hair was pulled back loosely, and she wore a simple yet elegant dress that complemented her figure, though there was something about the way she held herself that suggested unease. Giselle didn't speak immediately. Instead, she stood there, her gaze flickering over him as though taking in every detail of the room. His study, the piles of paperwork on his desk, the fireplace that had long since gone cold. "Ethan," she said finally, her voice low, "there's something I need to tell you." He rose from his chair slowly, his eyes meeting hers. The weight of her words pressed on him like an unseen hand, and for a split second, he thought of retreating. But no, he couldn't do that. Not now. He needed to face whatever this was. "I'm listening," he said quietly. She took a deep breath, stepping further into the room, her eyes never leaving his. "I've been thinking a lot about us. About everything, really. And I've come to realize something that I've been hiding, even from myself." Ethan's heart quickened, and he took a small step toward her. The tension between them seemed to draw tighter, like an invisible thread pulling them closer but keeping them apart all at once. "What is it, Giselle?" he asked, his voice betraying the hint of anxiety he felt. "What's been on your mind?" She hesitated, glancing down at her hands before looking back up at him. "I've been hiding the truth from you. About who I am, about why I agreed to this marriage. I thought I could keep it buried, that it wouldn't matter. But I was wrong." Ethan furrowed his brow. The truth? He had always known that Giselle wasn't exactly like the other women he had encountered, more complex, more reserved. But he hadn't expected this. You've been hiding the truth? He asked, a sharpness creeping into his tone. What truth? Giselle, if we're ever going to move forward, we have to be honest with each other. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, and when she opened them again, there was a fierce determination there that startled him. I didn't marry you just for the title, Ethan. And I didn't marry you simply because my father needed to secure my future. No. It was more complicated than that. Ethan's chest tightened, but he said nothing. He just stood there, listening, waiting for her to continue. His mind raced as he tried to piece together what she was saying. I married you, Giselle said slowly, as though the words were heavy on her tongue, because I needed an escape from the life I was living, from the people who were controlling my every move. I thought that, with you, I could finally be free. Her words hung in the air like a secret, and for the first time since their marriage, Ethan felt truly unmoored. He had known Giselle was strong, had always respected her for her independence, but he had never imagined this. Never imagined that she had been running from something far deeper than a mere social contract. What do you mean? Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. What were you running from? Giselle's eyes darkened, and she looked away, as though the answer was too painful to meet head-on. She turned her back to him, walking toward the large window that overlooked the sprawling estate. Her fingers brushed the edge of the curtains as she stared outside, her face reflecting the quiet torment of her words. My father, she said, her voice tight, has always been a man of ambition, and I've always been the tool he used to get what he wanted. He wanted a powerful alliance with Ashford, and I was the means to that end. But what you don't know, Ethan, is that he's always controlled me. My choices, my decisions, my freedom. I've spent my life trapped in his shadow, unable to make my own way. Until now. Ethan stood rooted to the spot, his heart pounding in his chest. He had thought he knew her story, had thought he understood her motivations. But now it seemed as if the woman standing before him was someone entirely different, someone with a past he couldn't fathom. You were trapped, Ethan finally managed, his voice rough with the revelation. By your own father? Giselle nodded, her shoulders stiff with the weight of her words. Yes. He never let me choose my path. Not with whom I'd marry, not with how I'd live my life. I was always the means to an end, just like your family sees you, Ethan. A pawn in a game of power. Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach as he absorbed her words. For a moment, he saw her not as the poised, confident woman he had married, but as a person, a woman who had been shaped by forces beyond her control. It made sense in a way. The cold distance she had shown, her reluctance to trust him. It wasn't just his coldness that had kept her at arm's length. It was her own scars, the wounds she had suffered long before he had entered the picture. Giselle turned back to face him, her expression softening slightly. I didn't want to need you, Ethan. But the truth is, I did. I needed this escape, and I thought you might be the key. But now I don't know what I'm supposed to feel. Ethan stepped closer to her, his heart heavy with the realization that everything he had assumed about this marriage, about his role in it, had been wrong. He had thought he was simply the man who would save her, who would restore order to his family name. But in truth, she had been trying to save herself all along. I'm sorry, Ethan said softly, his voice raw. I never knew. Giselle met his gaze, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite name. Pain, yes, but also something else. something that felt like the beginnings of understanding. "We can't change the past," she said quietly. "But perhaps we can start fresh." And for the first time, Ethan saw the possibility of something more. Something real between them. It wasn't about duty anymore. It wasn't about reputation or securing the Ashford legacy. It was about two people, both of them broken in their own ways, trying to rebuild something from the wreckage of their pasts. It wasn't going to be easy. But in this moment, at least, they were finally being honest with each other. Ethan's mind whirled as he sat at his desk, the quiet hum of the manor outside the study door doing little to settle his nerves. His hands were still trembling slightly from the conversation with Giselle, though he was certain she hadn't noticed. Or perhaps she had. He couldn't be sure. The morning had passed in a blur after her revelation. The truth that had been hanging between them for so long was finally laid bare, and with it came an overwhelming wave of guilt, uncertainty, and the faintest flicker of hope. He had spent years perfecting the art of control, of distancing himself from the messiness of human connection. Yet now, he found himself at a crossroads, a place where his carefully constructed walls seemed like nothing more than paper, ready to crumble beneath the weight of the truth. Giselle, for all her strength and grace, had been hiding too. Hiding from her past, from her father's manipulation, from the very idea that she could want something more than a strategic marriage. Ethan had expected many things from this union, but he had never expected to be part of her escape. His gaze shifted to the window. The garden outside was bathed in afternoon sunlight, the petals of the roses blooming with a vibrancy that seemed to mock his state of mind. He had always liked the order of the estate, the rows of neatly pruned trees, the well-maintained paths, the symmetry of the manor's towering walls. It was a perfect reflection of the life he had built for himself, one of order, control, and rigid expectations. But now, in the wake of Giselle's words, he realized how little he truly understood the life he had been living. His father's legacy, the heavy weight of the Ashford name, had always been his burden to carry. But this marriage, this alliance with Giselle, had been supposed to be his escape, his chance to ensure the future of the estate, to secure his place in society, to stabilize the shaky financial footing of the family legacy. And now, all of that seemed so hollow. He was snapped from his thoughts by a knock at the door. Before he could respond, it swung open, and Giselle entered, her figure standing in the doorway like a shadow. Her face was still pale, but there was a subtle shift in her demeanor, a certain weight to her presence that hadn't been there before. She was no longer the distant, aloof woman he had married, but someone far more vulnerable, someone more real. "Ethan," she said, her voice soft yet steady. "We need to talk." His heart clenched. The words she had spoken earlier still echoed in his mind. But this wasn't a conversation they could put off any longer. This was the moment they would either begin to move forward together or be lost in the rubble of their past mistakes. He stood up from his desk, gesturing toward the chair across from him. "Of course," he said, his tone calmer than he felt. "Please sit." Giselle walked toward the chair, her steps measured, her eyes never leaving his. She sat down slowly, folding her hands neatly in her lap, as if she were preparing for something much more formal. But her posture gave her away. There was tension in her every movement, an unspoken uncertainty that mirrored his own. "Ethan," she began again, her voice more hesitant now. "I meant what I said this morning, about needing to escape, about my father's control. She looked down at her hands. I didn't want to drag you into that, but I also couldn't keep pretending. I thought this marriage would be my chance to be free of all of that. But it hasn't turned out the way I expected. Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in deeper than before. He had never asked her about her past, not in any real way. He had never truly understood the burden she carried. His mind flashed back to all the times he had thought she was merely distant, cold, unwilling to open up to him. But now he saw it for what it was: self-preservation. She had been guarding herself, just as he had been, both of them afraid to trust, afraid to need one another. I never meant to make you feel trapped, she continued, her voice thick with emotion. But I don't know how to fix what's broken between us. Ethan's heart ached as he watched her struggle with her words. He hadn't realized how deeply her past had affected her, how much of her own self-worth had been wrapped up in her father's control over her life. In a way, they were both prisoners of their own making. He, bound by his father's legacy and expectations, and she, tied to a past that she couldn't escape. Giselle, he said gently, walking toward her. You're not trapped here. Not anymore. You're free to make your own choices now. And so am I. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to read the sincerity in his words. But what about us? Can we truly start over, Ethan? Can we build something real from what's left of this marriage? Ethan paused, taking a deep breath. He had spent so long trying to maintain control, trying to keep everything in order. But now he realized that control had been an illusion. The only way forward was through honesty and vulnerability, things he had never allowed himself to experience fully before. But if he was to have any hope of healing their fractured marriage, he had to be willing to take that leap. I think, he said carefully, that we've already begun to build something real. It may not be perfect, and it certainly won't be easy, but it's real. And that's where we have to start. Giselle's expression softened, and for the first time, she smiled. A small, tentative smile, but a smile nonetheless. I'm willing to try, she whispered. I'm willing to take that chance, Ethan. It was in that moment, as they both sat there, raw, vulnerable, and unsure, that Ethan felt a shift within him. They weren't simply two people bound together by duty anymore. They were two people choosing each other. Despite their flaws, despite their pasts. And for the first time, Ethan felt something more than just a contractual obligation. He felt hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to be free together. As the afternoon light began to fade, they sat together in silence, the weight of their unspoken promises hanging between them. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like they were facing it together, as partners. And that, Ethan realized, was more than he had ever expected from this marriage. It had been 3 days since Ethan and Giselle had spoken those first honest words to each other, the air between them still heavy with the raw emotions that had come to the surface. Yet, for all the weight in their hearts, something had shifted. A fragile sense of understanding lingered, threading through their conversations, their silences, their shared glances. It was nothing grand, nothing definitive, but it was enough to make Ethan believe, if only for a moment, that perhaps they could find something real in the wreckage of their marriage. Still, the truth that had been unveiled between them left scars, even if they didn't speak of them. The past, for both of them, was something neither could outrun, And as much as they might try to move forward, the remnants of their secrets lingered like shadows, just beyond reach. Ethan sat in his study, poring over the latest correspondence regarding the estate's finances. But his mind wandered. Giselle had been quieter these past few days. While she'd seemed more present, more engaged with him, there was an unspoken distance between them now, as though the truths they had shared had both bonded and alienated them at once. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ledger before him, but the numbers blurred. There was a part of him that wanted to reach for her, to reassure her, to show her that he truly understood the depth of her pain. But then another part of him, a part he didn't like, wondered if maybe it was all too late. Perhaps too much had been said, too much revealed. Could they ever go back to the way things were before? The thought filled him with a deep sense of loss. The sound of the door opening brought him back to reality. Giselle stepped into the room, her footsteps light, but her presence commanding. There was something different in her posture today. More purpose, perhaps more resolve. He noted how her eyes met his, without hesitation, as though she had made a decision and was now ready to face whatever came next. "You wanted to talk about something?" he asked, his voice soft, though the tension in the room was unmistakable. Giselle nodded, her fingers lightly brushing the edges of the chair opposite him. She didn't sit immediately, but rather stood, gathering her thoughts, as if she was preparing herself for something difficult. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady, "about everything we've discussed, about my father, about why I agreed to this marriage in the first place, and—" she paused, "about the way I've kept so much from you." Ethan watched her closely, his heart tightening in his chest. "You don't have to explain yourself, Giselle," he said, but his voice was low, uncertain. He had no idea how to proceed. This was uncharted territory for him. "We both have things we need to work through, things that we—" "No," she interrupted, stepping closer to the desk. "I need to tell you, Ethan, because I realize now that in hiding the truth from you, I only made it worse for both of us." She took a deep breath, her gaze dropping to the floor before returning to his. "I didn't just marry you to escape my father's grasp," she confessed, her voice low but resolute. "I thought that if I could find a man who would accept me, flaws and all, then maybe I could stop being controlled. But that was only part of it. I wanted to feel valued, seen, not just as the daughter of a man who bought his way into the nobility, but as a woman in my own right." Her words hung in the air, heavy with honesty. Ethan's stomach churned. He had known that their marriage was never simply about duty for her, but hearing it laid out so plainly, so vulnerably, brought the reality crashing down. He stood, moving to her side with a few quick strides, his eyes never leaving hers. "And what do you see now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the weight of his question pressing down on him. Giselle's eyes met his, searching, contemplating. "I see a man who has built his entire life on control, Ethan. A man who has spent years pretending that what he wanted didn't matter, that what he needed didn't matter. And yet, despite everything, you're still here. You still care." Ethan felt a pang in his chest, the sting of her words more potent than he had anticipated. "I don't know what you want me to say," he murmured, his gaze softening. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if it's even possible." Giselle shook her head, a slight smile tugging at her lips. "You don't have to fix anything, Ethan. I'm not asking you to make everything right. I'm just asking you to see me. To see the woman standing before you. Not as an obligation or a duty, but as a person who is trying just as much as you are. Ethan stepped back, the silence between them thick with unspoken emotions. Her words lingered, resonating deep within him. He had spent so long hiding behind walls, pushing everyone away, convinced that he could handle everything on his own. But here, standing before Giselle, he realized how little he truly understood about the world they were now navigating together. For the first time, he allowed himself to truly listen, not just to the words she was speaking, but to the emotions behind them. The longing, the vulnerability, the desire to be seen and loved, not for what she could offer, but for who she was. He had taken her for granted, assuming that their marriage was a simple arrangement, a means to an end. But it wasn't that simple, was it? The ties that bound them, those they had both ignored, were much deeper than he had realized. "I've been a fool," Ethan finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've spent too long trying to control everything around me, thinking that I could keep us both safe by hiding behind walls. I never understood the cost. I never realized what I was doing to us." Giselle's eyes softened, and she reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "It's not too late," she said gently, her voice soothing. "We can still make something of this. We can still build a future together. But only if we let go of the past, only if we stop pretending that we have all the answers." Ethan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. For the first time in years, he felt something real stir within him. Hope. A chance for redemption, not just for their marriage, but for himself. He had been so focused on maintaining control that he had forgotten what it was like to truly live, to truly love. But maybe, just maybe, they could still find their way to something meaningful. "I want to try," he said quietly, meeting her gaze. "I want to see you, Giselle. I want to understand you. And I want to be with you, not because it's expected or required, but because I choose you." Her eyes softened, and for the first time since their marriage had begun, she smiled, genuinely, deeply. "Then let's begin again," she said. And in that moment, Ethan knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Ethan woke the next morning with the heavy weight of uncertainty still pressing on his chest. But there was something different about today. The room was quiet, save for the faint rustling of the trees outside his window as the early morning light crept through the curtains. He had spent the previous night in deep thought, replaying the conversations he and Giselle had shared. So many raw truths, so many confessions, and so many unspoken promises. It was a lot to digest, and yet he felt something shifting within him. Something that hadn't been there before. Hope. The air between them had been thick with tension for so long, but now it felt lighter. Their walls, those barriers they had each built out of pride and fear, were beginning to crumble. Slowly, carefully, they had started to rebuild what was broken. But rebuilding wasn't easy. There would be no magic resolution, no instantaneous healing. Ethan knew that now. Their past, the misunderstandings, the lies, those things could never just vanish. But perhaps, just perhaps, they could forge something new from the ashes. He stood from his bed and moved toward the window, looking out over the sprawling grounds of Ashford Manor. The estate was as vast as his responsibilities, as sprawling as the expectations that had once defined him. But for the first time, It felt like his own, like it could be a place of change. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't face it alone. Downstairs, Giselle was already awake, moving through the house with a quiet grace that seemed to echo the peace she had brought into his life. Her presence, once so distant, was now an anchor for him. She had always been strong, always carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had been forced to survive. But now, there was a gentleness in her that Ethan hadn't seen before. A softness he hadn't believed possible. He found her in the kitchen, standing at the stove, stirring something in a pot. The warmth of the room and the scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. And for a brief moment, Ethan allowed himself to imagine a different kind of life. A life where the tension between them had never existed. A life where they could simply be together. "Good morning," he said softly, his voice rough with the emotion he hadn't quite figured out how to express. Giselle turned, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time since their wedding, he saw no walls in her gaze. Only openness, only trust. "Good morning," she replied with a smile that made his heart skip a beat. It was a small thing, but it meant more than any grand gesture. Ethan crossed the room, standing by the counter, watching her with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. "You've been up for hours, haven't you?" She chuckled, though it was soft and low. "I've always been an early riser. I find the quiet of the morning comforting." He leaned against the counter, watching her as she worked. "I suppose we should talk about what happens next, shouldn't we?" Giselle paused for a moment, setting the spoon down and looking at him carefully. "Yes, I think we should." Her voice was steady, but there was something in her eyes, a hint of vulnerability, that made him want to reach out and hold her. He didn't. Not yet. But the desire was there, raw and undeniable. "Do you think we can fix this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know it's not going to be easy. I know it'll take time, but I want to try. I want to build something real with you, Giselle." Her gaze softened, and she stepped closer to him, her hand brushing against his arm in a gentle, reassuring touch. "I know," she said quietly. "I want that too, but it won't be easy. We both have to work at it. We have to let go of the things that held us back." Ethan nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. "I've spent so long running from my own emotions, from the truth of what I felt. I pushed you away because I was scared of losing control. But I don't want to be that man anymore." She smiled again, a smile that reached her eyes this time. "Then let's start by being honest with each other. From here on out, no more secrets, no more hiding behind walls. We build something real, together." For a moment, there was silence between them. But it wasn't the heavy silence that had once filled the room. It was different, lighter, filled with possibility. The tension that had once strangled them seemed to dissipate, replaced by something deeper, something more lasting. That evening, they sat together at the dinner table, the space between them no longer feeling like a chasm. The meal was simple, but it didn't matter. For the first time, they shared a meal not as strangers forced into a marriage, but as two people willing to see each other fully, to understand each other's hearts. They spoke of things they hadn't dared to say before, their childhoods, their dreams, the things they wanted from life, but hadn't known how to ask for. They talked of the future, of what their marriage could be if they stopped hiding behind their pasts and instead moved forward together. As the evening wore on, the conversation shifted to something lighter, something more familiar. Giselle laughed, the sound like music to Ethan's ears, and for a moment, it felt as though all the weight of the past had fallen away. He couldn't erase it, of course. He couldn't undo the mistakes they'd both made. But perhaps, he thought, he could make it right, step by step, moment by moment. And in that moment, as he watched her smile, he realized that he didn't need to have all the answers. He didn't need to know how this marriage would end or where it would take them. All he knew was that they had a chance now, a real chance, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. "I'm glad we're doing this," he said quietly, his voice sincere. "I know it's not perfect, and I know we still have a long way to go, but I'm glad we're finally here." Giselle looked up at him, her expression softening. "So am I," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "We may not have started this the right way, but that doesn't mean we can't make it work." Ethan smiled at her, a genuine smile that he hadn't been able to muster in a long time. "I'm willing to try. For you. For us." And just like that, something began to change. Their journey together had only just begun. But for the first time, it felt as though they were heading in the right direction. The road ahead was still uncertain, but it was no longer one they had to walk alone. Together, they could face whatever came next.